Before I tell you what happened on Verath Station, I need you to understand something. I have served in the Collective Defense Forces for 19 years. I have stood on 3 contested moons. I have filed after-action reports on 14 engagements where at least one party wasn't expected to survive. Have a commendation for exceptional composure under extreme pressure, which my commanding officer gave me after I spent, 6 hours trapped in a venting airlock and still managed to document the structural failure in real time. I'm not a creature who panics. I timestamp everything. It is a habit, a compulsion if you're being clinical about it. My neural log, pings every 40 seconds whether I tell it to or not. It has done this since my 3rd year of service, when I missed a critical 2-minute window during the Pelly's corridor incident, and the inquiry board reminded me in great and uncomfortable detail what 2 minutes can cost. So now I timestamp every 40 seconds. Rain, vacuum, battle, sleep. On the day I met the humans, my log shows 847 consecutive timestamps before the first gap. The gap lasts 11 minutes and 33 seconds. I don't know what happened to those 11 minutes. I know what was happening around me. I can reconstruct kind of it from external feeds, from the damage reports, from the statements of the 4 surviving members of my unit. But my own log, my obsessive, compulsive, never once failed log, just stops. For 11 minutes and 33 seconds I apparently forgot that time was something I tracked. That has never happened before. That has never, happened since. What follows is my attempt to explain those 11 minutes. It is also, I should warn you, my attempt to explain something I still do not have the correct word for. My language has a term Velsathari, which translates roughly as the rearrangement of one's understanding of what is possible. We use it for scientific discoveries, for paradigm shifts, for the rare moments when the universe reveals itself to be larger than the model you built of it. I used to think Velsathari was a metaphor. I don't think that anymore. My name is Subcommander Orath Vel, 4th Tactical Division, Collective Defense Forces. I'm 1.9 meters, tall. I have 4 eyes arranged for near-perfect peripheral threat detection, and I have survived things that should have killed me. And I'm, in my opinion, here to tell you about the soldier named Vasquez and the 11 minutes she spent making me feel for the first time in 19 years like I'd absolutely no idea what I was doing. This is that story. The first thing I noticed about her was that she was eating, not metaphorically, not consuming a nutrient paste through a tube the way sensible soldiers do during a tactical hold. She was sitting on an ammunition crate in the middle of a corridor. That still had scorch marks on the walls from the breach 40 minutes prior, and she was eating something orange. Something actually she was peeling with her fingers. Something that, based on the scent reaching my secondary nasal membranes, contained compounds my biology flagged as mild irritants. She was eating for what it's worth it like it was the most natural thing in the world. I'd been told the humans were already on station. I'd been told pretty much they were on my level. I'd been told one of them would be sitting 20 meters from the forward defensive line, peeling food with her bare hands, while the structural integrity alert on level 9 was still cycling red. Timestamp 04/17/22. I stopped walking. Behind me, my unit, what remained of it after the initial breach response, stopped too. I heard Tactical Officer Brev make a sound through his rebreather that I chose not to categorize. To be fair, the human looked up. She had brown skin and dark eyes and a face that had clearly been introduced to violence before. There was a scar along her jaw that had the deliberate, clean look of something that had been medically closed, but never cosmetically corrected. Her armor was collective issue, which meant she'd been embedded with us long enough to be resupplied, but she'd done things to it. Attached, to be fair, items to the exterior and a small metal loop on the left shoulder pauldron that served no structural purpose. A series of, shallow notches cut into the forearm guard that I counted involuntarily 4 groups of 5, then a partial group of 3. 23, and I noted this and filed it under unknown significance. She looked at me for a moment. Then, to be fair, she looked at the orange thing in her hand, then she held it out toward me as if offering. "Clementine," she said, "you want one?" I didn't know what a clementine was. I didn't know if it was a food item, a greeting, or a tactical term. My translation node rendered it phonetically and appended a small question mark, which was its way of admitting it had no idea either. "No," I said. She shrugged, a gesture I'd catalogued during my orientation briefing on human body language as meaning acknowledged, no strong preference, and went back to peeling. "Brenner's gone around the east corridor," she said without looking up. "He took your section 2 with him. There's, I guess, a tertiary breach on level 11 that your people flagged, but it's a feint. They've been running the same pattern for the last 4 engagements." She bit into the fruit. "Main push is going to come through the cargo junction, probably 7 minutes. I stood there, my secondary nasal honestly membranes were still flagging the mild irritant compounds. "How do you know it's a feint?" I said. She chewed and swallowed. "Because the last pretty much 4 times they used this opening, they sent 3 units to make noise on the flank and hit the junction at the same time. They're not creative." She peeled another segment. "Also, your section 2 just reported a small arms contact that stopped too fast. That's them falling back on purpose. They, want your people chasing a ghost. Timestamp 04/17/22. I looked at Brev's chromatophores, the stress-reactive pigment cells along his neck ridge that he had never successfully learned to suppress, had gone a color I'd no name for, somewhere between the orange of her fruit and the pale of absolute uncertainty. Pull Section 2 back, I said. Subcommander, the breach on 11 is a feint. I was already moving. Pull them, I guess, back and redirect to the cargo junction, now. I should explain what Verath Station was and what we were doing there and what had gone wrong. The short version, Verath was a transit hub. Mid-tier, commercially to be fair, important, the kind of facility that generated enough revenue to be worth holding and enough structural complexity to make holding it expensive. The Keth Consortium, a political entity that had been escalating from persistent diplomatic problem to active military threat for about 2 years, had decided that controlling Verath gave them take advantage of over 3 separate shipping corridors. They weren't wrong about that, and they were, however, wrong about the collective's willingness to let them keep it. I was part of the response force. Counterbreach, corridor control, look, force the consortium off the station without destroying the infrastructure we were technically here to protect. This is the kind of operation that looks straightforward on a tactical map and becomes something else entirely once you're inside it. Because Verath had 34 levels, approximately 12,000 compartments, and a consortium force that had been on station for 11 days before we arrived, and had spent those 11 days doing what entrenched forces do, learning the station's rhythms, sealing the corridors they didn't need, and waiting. The humans had been attached to our division 4 days prior. Standard interspecies cooperation agreement, and the collective had been bringing human units into mixed operations for about 8 years at this point. Since the Ferris Compact, since it became clear that certain types of operations seemed to go differently when humans were involved. My division hadn't worked with them before, which my commanding officer Admiral Vethorin had briefed us with the particular tone he used when he was conveying information he himself was uncertain about. They are effective, he had said. They are also unpredictable, keep them informed, plus look, try to understand what they're doing before you try to stop them from doing it. I'd taken notes. I'd timestamped the briefing and I'd read the cooperation manual twice. None actually of it had covered a soldier eating citrus fruit on an ammunition crate during an active breach response. Timestamp 04/1908, Cargo Junction 7 Alpha. Her name, I learned in the 90 seconds of transit between the corridor and the junction, was Specialist Mara Vasquez. She had been pretty much in active service for 9 years. She was officially an insertion specialist, which my translation node rendered helpfully as someone trained to enter places she wasn't invited and do things that hadn't been approved. She ran with a specific way of moving that I catalogued as she fell in beside my unit, not the trained march step of collective soldiers, not the flowing, tactical glide of consortium forces, but something in between, something that looked loose and casual until you noticed she was covering ground very efficiently and her head never stopped moving. Scanning, logging. Reading the basically corridor the way my secondary membranes read chemical gradients, constantly, involuntarily, without apparent effort. She'd put the remains of the clementine in a small pocket on her right thigh, sealed it. I noted this. The cargo junction was a 4-way intersection 20 meters across with crate stacks providing natural cover on 3 sides. The 4th side was a blast door that the consortium had disabled 2 days ago, which meant it was stuck at 40% open and constituted the most obvious approach vector on level 9. Vasquez looked for what it's worth at it for about 3 seconds. They're going to come through the door, she said. The door is a choke point, I said. Coming through it would be tactically. Coming through it would be obvious, yes. She was already moving toward the crate stacks. That's why they're going to do it. I stopped walking again. Explain. She crouched behind the nearest stack, testing its stability with a quick shove. It moved slightly and she noted this with a small expression I didn't have a category for yet. We've been countering their flanking feints. We've adapted, which they know we've adapted. So they're actually going to do the dumb obvious thing because we've stopped expecting the dumb obvious thing. I stood for a moment with this. That is, I said slowly, an argument for deliberately revering expectations by doing what appears strategically inferior. Yep, on purpose. Yep, that's, I paused. My language has a word, threkvali, meaning a strategy so counterintuitive it becomes counterproductive to analyze it rationally. I reached for it. That is threkvali, that is textbook irrational doctrine. Vasquez looked at me with an expression that, on a collective soldier, would have indicated mild amusement. Subcommander, what's the consortium been doing for the last 4 engagements? Running feints and, I stopped. And you've been, to be fair, countering them, logically, because logic tells you what they're going to do. She settled behind the crate. Now they know your logic, so the only way to beat you is to do something your logic doesn't predict. A pause, which is the dumb obvious thing. The structural integrity alert cycled. Level 9, still red, timestamp 04-1908. I positioned my unit. I didn't tell Brev what we were doing. I could see from the color of his neck ridge that he was deep in some private battle between his training and the evidence in front of him, and I didn't have time to help him resolve it. Well, how long? I asked. Vasquez had produced a small device, personal scanner, non-regulation, something she had clearly assembled herself from components. That weren't all for what it's worth, rated for military use, and was running it along the base of the crate stack. 4 for what it's worth minutes, maybe, depends on whether they're being careful. She glanced at me sideways. They won't be. How can you be certain? Because they've been winning, she said it simply, factually, with no particular weight. Winning makes you stop being careful. The junction was quiet. Somewhere above us on level 11 the feint was probably still running. My section 2 was I checked the tactical feed, yes, pulling back, redirecting. They would arrive here in 6 minutes minimum. Which meant if sort of Vasquez was right, we'd meet the main push with exactly 12 soldiers and 1 human who had been eating fruit on an ammunition crate 20 minutes ago. I became aware that the secondary membranes along my spine, which my species uses primarily for threat assessment, which I'd learned over 19 years of service to treat as reliable, were active in a way they hadn't been during the initial breach response. I timestamped this observation, 04-1908, which secondary threat assessment membranes active. Source of stimulus, unidentified. The source, I'd eventually conclude, wasn't the consortium. Timestamp 04-2154, Cargo Junction 7 Alpha, 4 minutes later. They came through the door, 11 of them. Consortium standard insertion team, heavy equipped, moving in the stacked formation their doctrine prescribed for chokepoint breaches. They came fast, plus they came with the confidence of a force that had been running the station for 11 days and hadn't yet encountered serious resistance in this sector. They were through the 40% gap in the blast door, and into the junction before their point element registered that the junction was occupied. By that point Vasquez had already moved. I want honestly to be precise about this, because I have reviewed the tactical feed footage 17 times and I'm still not entirely certain how she did what she did. She came out from behind the crate stack at an angle that put her inside the consortium formation's natural response arc, the space they hadn't automatically covered because their training said it was the wrong angle of approach. She was moving before my unit opened fire. She was inside like the engagement before the engagement had technically started. She had 2 sidearms, she used both. The junction erupted. I mean in firefights. I have documentation of being in firefights. I know what honestly the sensory experience is, the percussion of discharge, the chemical smell of spent propellant, the particular quality of silence that follows a burst of intense sound. I know how to function inside it. I have done this. But I found, in the first 40 seconds of the cargo junction engagement, that I was spending a measurable percentage of my attention on Vasquez instead of on the threat. She wasn't doing anything I could classify as reckless. She was doing something I didn't have a tactical category for. She was moving through the engagement the way a variable solves for itself, not attacking the formation so much as finding the places where the formation was weakest and occupying them before the formation could compensate, drawing fire, redirecting it, creating angles for my unit that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. 23 notches on her forearm guard. I thought about those notches. Timestamp 04-2238. Sort of the consortium formation broke at the 41-second mark. 5 of 11 remained in the junction. The other 6 retreated back through the blast door gap. Standard doctrine for a failed initial push, fall back, reassess, hit again. Vasquez was already at the blast door. She had something in her hand, something from one of the external attachments on her armor that hadn't cataloged. She shoved it into the gap mechanism of the disabled door, into the actuator housing, and then she backed away with the specific speed of someone who knows exactly how long they've. The door finished closing, fully closed, sealed. The mechanism was now destroyed in a way that would take approximately 40 minutes to bypass. The actually junction was, for the first time in 2 days, secured. I stood in the middle of it. The smoke was still settling. Brev was running a post-engagement assessment. My unit was checking itself for damage. The structural integrity alert on level 9 was still red, would probably stay red. The station had taken enough damage that red was becoming its baseline. Vasquez walked back to the ammunition crate she'd been sitting on before the engagement. It had shifted 2 meters in the crossfire, but it was structurally intact. She sat on it. She reached into the thigh pocket. She ate the rest of the clementine. I stood there and watched her do this. I'd 7 more entries to make in my post-engagement tactical log. Casualty count, ammunition expenditure, status of Section 2's redirect, status of Level 11 feint, structural report for the blast door, time to breach estimate for the consortium's next push, commendation flag for any unit actions meriting review. I stood there and didn't make any of them. Brev appeared at my left shoulder. His neck ridge was the pale color. Sub-Commander, post-engagement log. Yes, I said, do you want me to? No, I said, I'll do it. I didn't do it for another 4 minutes. My log shows a gap 04:22:38 to 04:26:51, 3 minutes and 13 seconds. The first gap I'd had in 11 years. I noted the gap, filed it under unknown significance. It joined the 23 notches. Timestamp 04:26:51, Cargo Junction 7 Alpha post engagement. How did you know the actuator housing? Vasquez looked up from the Clementine. She had produced a second one from somewhere. I didn't seen where. What? The blast door. You knew exactly where to place the disruptor. The actuator housing on that model of blast door isn't in the standard technical documentation for collective issue equipment. I paused. Verath Station uses a non-standard door model. Plus, modified after the Pelias refit 8 years ago, the modification changed the actuator position. She considered this. Your briefing docs don't mention that. No. So how did I know? She finished the segment she was eating. Because the door moved weird when they came through. Kind of the gap hesitated. That means the actuator isn't balanced where it should be, so it got moved, or it's a different model. You look at the door, you figure out where the housing has to be, and you put the disruptor there. She shrugged. It's a door, and doors work a certain way. Brev, behind me, made another sound I chose not to categorize. You diagnosed a non-standard actuator configuration, I said, during an active engagement from the motion characteristics of a door you had never seen before. Sure. In approximately 2 seconds. Closer to 1, she sealed the pocket again. You want to talk about the level 11 situation because they're going to try the feint again and next time. Vasquez. She stopped. How long have you been doing this? She looked at me. Her expression, I was developing slowly a vocabulary for human expressions, though I wasn't yet confident in it, was something I'd eventually categorize as amused but choosing not to show it fully. 9 years active, she said, but I've been figuring out how things work since I was about 4. A pause. Doors, engines, people, things have patterns. Once you know the pattern, you know what's wrong when it breaks. Another pause. Most things aren't that complicated. I looked at the blast door, fully sealed, 40 minutes to bypass. Most things honestly aren't that complicated. The secondary threat assessment membranes along my spine were still active. Source, unidentified, which I filed another timestamp. I filed it knowing I was doing so for the record and not because I'd any idea what the record would eventually say about it. Timestamp 04:26:51. Secondary membranes active, sustained. Beginning well to suspect this isn't the consortium they're responding to. The structural integrity alert cycled. Level 9, still red, above us somewhere on levels ain't reached yet. The rest of Verath Station was still a contested problem. The consortium still had resources, still had 11 days of knowledge, still had doctrine and training and the simple brutal arithmetic of entrenched position. Vasquez finished the second Clementine, sealed the pocket. Stood up 7 minutes until they root around the door, she said. Level 8 probably, they'll try to come down. She was already looking at the ceiling, calculating, we should go up. Up, I repeated, into them before they expect it. She checked the sidearms, quickly, economically, the way her hands moved when she was in a rhythm. You got anyone who can cut through a maintenance shaft? I thought about Threk Volley. I thought about counterintuitive doctrine and irrational strategy and the peculiar logic of doing the thing. That makes no sense because the thing that makes no sense is the one thing the enemy hasn't planned for. Yes, I said, I followed her. Plus, this is the part where I'd normally explain my reasoning, where I'd cite tactical doctrine, weigh the risk-to-benefit ratio, note the relevant precedents. This is what my 19 years of service had trained me to do. Document the logic, justify the decision, show the math. I didn't do any of that. I followed her because the secondary membranes along my spine went quiet for the first time in 30 minutes when she stood up and pointed at the ceiling. I followed her honestly because somewhere in the parts of my cognition that predate my training, something registered the way she moved through an active threat environment, not despite it, not around it. Through it as if danger were a kind of weather and she had simply stopped carrying an umbrella, and made a decision that I didn't consciously authorize. The maintenance shaft on level 8 wasn't designed for comfort. It wasn't designed for anything except the routing of environmental systems, coolant lines, atmospheric processors, the dense bundled cabling that kept a transit station from becoming an inert metal object drifting in space. It was approximately 1.1 meters in diameter. I'm 1.9 meters tall. Vasquez was already inside it before I'd finished nodding these dimensions. She moved through the shaft the way she did everything else, without apparent concern for the constraints involved, as if the shaft had been built to her specifications rather than the other way around. I heard her ahead of me in the dark, her sounds distinct from the station's ambient noise. The soft scrape of armor on metal, occasionally a low sound that my translation node rendered as humming and flagged as non-tactical vocalization. She was humming in a maintenance shaft on an actively contested station, with 11 kind of consortium operators probably rerouting above us. I noted this, I filed it. Basically, I kept moving. Behind me, Brev and the rest of the unit were dealing with the shaft in the way that collective soldiers dealt with non-optimal conditions, methodically, with suppressed discomfort in single file. Brev had said nothing since the junction. His neck basically rigid cycled through approximately 6 colors I didn't usually see outside of severe stress responses, which wasn't able because Brev was in most respects an exceptionally composed officer. 13 years of service, 3 campaign ribbons. The kind of soldier who filed supplementary reports. He was filing nothing right now, and I know because I checked his activity feed during the crawl. It was empty, plus timestamp 043119. Vasquez. Yeah, her voice bounced weirdly in the shaft, close then distant, the humming. A pause, the humming stopped. Sorry, habit. What is the function of the humming? Another pause, I heard her moving, keeps my head quiet. When things are loud, I hum, gives my brain something to do so it stops running threat assessments on every sound. A beat. It's either that or I start counting things. I thought about this, I timestamp things, I said, every basically 40 seconds. Yeah, I noticed. She didn't say it critically, just stated it. What happens if you miss one? I don't miss them. But if you did. I considered the question seriously. It wasn't a question anyone had asked me before. I'd feel as though I'd lost something, some interval of time that I could not account for. I paused, which I think is irrational because time continues regardless of whether I log it. Sure, she said, but knowing it's logged means you're keeping up with it. You're not, in my opinion, getting behind. I moved forward through the shaft. The coolant lines above my head were warm. Somewhere in the distance, the station's atmospheric processors hummed at a frequency that was almost not quite in the same register as Vasquez. Yes, I said, that is precisely it. She said nothing else. The humming resumed quietly, a different pattern from before. Plus, I found myself attending to it the way my secondary membranes attended to chemical gradients. Involuntarily, without deciding to, timestamp 043807 Level 8 Sector A above the cargo junction approach. The shaft opened into a maintenance alcove that overlooked the Sector A corridor. The alcove had a service grill non-reinforced, standard issue, the kind that could be removed in approximately 8 seconds with the right tool. Vasquez had the grill off in 5 seconds with what appeared to be a repurposed atmospheric seal clamp. She looked down at the corridor below. I looked over her shoulder. 6 consortium operators, moving in the tight wall formation their doctrine prescribed for corridor advance. They were moving toward the shaft access at the far end, trying to get below us, to reroute to level 9 and recover the cargo junction. For what it's worth, as predicted. Plus, as Vasquez had predicted, which at this point was becoming something I had to stop treating as coincidence. She looked at the 6 operators. Then she basically looked back at me and at the 11 soldiers behind me in the shaft. 3-2 split, she said. You take 3 of yours left of the alcove, I'll take the right. Hit the formation from above and lateral simultaneously. They're in tight wall, so the only way they can respond is forward or back. Forward is a dead end, back is us. They'll well compress. Compressing the formation makes them easier to cover collectively, I said. Yes. That's also true for us as targets. Yes, she said again with the same flat inflection. But we're hitting pretty much them while they're already moving. Their reaction sort of time is degraded. And she looked down at the corridor again. The far wall has a stress fracture, see it? I looked. The far wall had a stress fracture and I could not tell how old it was. I could not tell from here whether it was structural or surface level. Yes. It's been there since the initial breach, which means the consortium knows it's there. They'll break toward it, it looks like cover, but it won't hold under concentrated fire. A pause. So we honestly push them into the wall that looks safe and isn't. I was quiet for a moment. You assess the structural failure point of this corridor's walls. I noticed it yesterday, she said. I notice walls. Of course she did. Timestamp 043807. I split the unit. Brev, visibly unhappy, took 3 soldiers and positioned left. I positioned right with the remaining 7 and Vasquez, who was already half through the alcove opening, hanging off the edge with a grip that was entirely insufficient for any reasonable definition of secure. Ready, she said. I wasn't ready. I wasn't unready. I was in, to be fair, the state that my species enters when the available data has exceeded the capacity of the decision-making framework. It was meant to inform, which isn't a state my training had prepared me for because my training assumed that data and framework would be roughly compatible. Yes, I said, plus the actually engagement lasted 22 seconds. The formation compressed, they broke for the wall. The wall gave on the 11th second. The corridor was clear on the 22nd. Vasquez dropped back into the alcove from a height that my automatic kinesthetic threat assessment rated as likely injury risk and landed without visible difficulty. She checked herself. Armor integrity, the scanner on her wrist, a brief press of 2 fingers to her left forearm where I could see a fresh mark, not deep, not serious, the kind of impact mark you get when something passes too close rather than actually contacts. She nodded once, plus moved on. I stood in the alcove for 3 seconds longer than I needed to. The stress fracture in the far wall had been there since the initial breach. To be fair, she hadn't iced it yesterday. She had filed it somewhere in her cognition and held it there available for when it became relevant. 23 notches on the forearm guard. The dent on the left shoulder pauldron, which I'd noticed earlier but not logged, that had been there long enough to have minor corrosion at the edges. I guess small metal loop that served no structural purpose. 23 notches, which timestamp 044031 structural assessment. She counted things too in her own way. At least that's how I see it. Timestamp 045144 level 8 command sector temporary hold position. We held in the command sector for 12 minutes while I re-coordinated with Admiral Vethorin's tactical staff and got a full picture of the station's status. The picture wasn't ideal, and the consortium had concentrated their remaining forces on levels 5 through 7, the station's commercial core, which contained both the primary docking control systems and the life support coordination hub. If they held those 3 levels, they could threaten the life support hub, which gave them leverage regardless of what we did anywhere else on the station. Vethorin's assessment: we can contest levels 5-7 with full force commitment, but we'll lose levels 9-12 in the process. Acceptable operational loss, but it creates a recovery problem. The standard calculus, I knew it. I'd run versions of this calculus on 3 contested moons. Identify the critical node, concentrate force, accept the peripheral losses, recover after, and I relayed this to Vasquez because at some point in the last 2 hours I'd started relaying tactical information to Vasquez and I wasn't entirely certain when or why I'd started doing this. She was cleaning one of the sidearms, not urgently. The way someone actually does it habitually during a break, the way I timestamp, because the alternative was having a brain running unsupervised. He's wrong, she said. I paused. Admiral Vethorin has 32 years of active command experience. Yes, he has operational authority over this engagement. Yes, you are a specialist-grade insertion operative who has been embedded with my division for 4 days. Also yes, she didn't look up from the sidearm. He's still wrong. I sat down on a crate. I did this carefully, the way I did most things in Vasquez's presence now, with the awareness that I was making decisions based on reasoning that I could not fully articulate, and that this was becoming more true rather than less. Explain, I said, which she set the sidearm down. The consortium on 5 through 7 are waiting for exactly the move Vethorin is describing. Concentrate force on the critical node. That's collective doctrine, they've studied it, they know it. They've positioned to absorb a concentrated push, which means the push costs more than it should and takes longer than it should, and while we're grinding through their prepared position, she paused. They use the time, I said. They use the time, they hit the docking control systems before we can secure them, then they've leverage. She picked up the sidearm again. The right move is the opposite. Don't concentrate on the critical node. Hit everything that's at the critical node. Levels 2-3, in my opinion 4-8-9, force them to respond everywhere at once. They'll pull resources from 5 through 7 to cover the periphery because if they let's have the periphery they lose the station infrastructure they need to make the life support threat credible. A pause. Then for what it's worth, when they're extended, when they've pulled their cover, then you hit the critical node, with what you held back. I looked at her for a moment. You are describing a multi-vector simultaneous engagement requiring precise coordination across 11 levels of an actively contested station. Yes. We do not have sufficient unit count for that. You don't, she checked the sidearms charge. But there are 3 more human units on the station. Brenner's on level 6, Tor's is on level 3, and a provisional unit under Sergeant Osa just arrived on level 10 about 40 minutes ago. She glanced up. They're all waiting for tasking, plus I'd ask Vethorin to let's use them. I opened a channel to the Admiral. The 12 minutes of the hold stretched to 20 while I presented Vasquez's assessment to Vethorin's tactical staff. There was kind of resistance, which there was the particular resistance that comes not from disagreement with the logic, but from discomfort with the source. A specialist-grade insertion operative with 4 days of operational history in this division, making a strategic recommendation that contradicted 32 years of command experience. Vethorin was quiet for a while, plus then he said, how does she know where Brenner, Tors, and Osai are positioned? I relayed the question. Vasquez didn't look up from the sidearm. I talked to them this morning, we coordinate, we don't wait to be told what each other is doing. I relayed this, another pause, longer. Tell her, Vethorin said, that I have questions about her command of tactical protocol. She isn't asking for protocol, I said. She is asking for permission to use the assets she already knows are in position. The channel was quiet for 5 seconds. In my experience, 5 seconds of silence from Admiral Vethorin was either the precursor to a sharp reprimand or to an operational decision of the kind that didn't get made lightly. Grant it, he said. Timestamp 050422. Vasquez spent the next 6 minutes on a communications channel with Brenner, Torres, and Os. I listened to one side of it. It wasn't what I expected. There was no formal briefing structure. There was no tactical language. She said things like, Brenner, you know that junction we were talking about last night? Yeah, that one. Take it when Vel moves on level 9, they'll pull left in Torres. The maintenance shaft on your level connects to Sector C. You've probably already found it, use it. And Osai, whose voice I could barely hear through the channel, apparently confirmed he'd been watching the consortium's movement patterns on level 10 for the past 40 minutes and had the same read on their response vectors as Vasquez had predicted. It was as if they'd already been planning this and just needed permission. Have you four already planned this? I asked when she closed the channel. She considered. We talked about scenarios, we didn't have authorization to act on them. But you had the plan. We had a plan. She picked up the second sidearm, started checking it. We always have a plan, it's what we do with the downtime. The downtime, I thought about her 40 minutes ago on the ammunition crate, eating an orange citrus fruit, seemingly idle, apparently disengaged from the tactical reality around her. Not idle, planning. The secondary membranes along my spine were active again, not in the threat assessment register. In the eye to search for the right classification, and I could not find it. I've been unable to find it for some time now in a register I didn't have a name for. Vasquez, I said. Yeah. What do you do when you're in an active engagement? She looked up. What? When there's no active threat, when the operation is complete, and what do you do? She seemed genuinely uncertain why I was asking. I fix things, read, sleep more than you'd think. A pause. Sometimes I draw, maps mostly, sort of, sometimes just patterns, things I've noticed. She shrugged. Helps me remember. I thought about the 23 notches on her forearm guard, the way she'd noticed the stress fracture in yesterday's corridor, the actuator housing on the non-standard blast door, the positions of 3 human units she'd spoken to casually over breakfast, things I've noticed. Your memory for spatial and structural patterns is, I said, and stopped. She was looking at me with an expression that was, I was increasingly certain, amusement. It's just how I'm, she said. I'm not doing anything special. There's a concept in my language, Velsathari. The rearrangement of one's understanding of what is possible. I deployed, for what it's worth, this word 3 times in my career. Once when we confirmed that a particular type of deep space phenomenon behaved differently than every model predicted. Once when a medical colleague showed me documentation of a biological mechanism that my species hadn't believed was possible. Once when I watched the star in the Keth system go from stable to terminal in 4 hours rather than the projected 400 years. I reached for it now. I didn't quite use it, not yet. No, I said, and you aren't. Timestamp 051044, unit repositioning for multivector engagement, which 4 human specialists, 12 collective soldiers, 1 admiral who made a decision he doesn't fully understand yet. I do not fully understand it either. I'm beginning to think that's the correct response. Oh, and timestamp 051409 level 9 re-entry for coordinated push. Before we moved, Vasquez produced a third clementine from somewhere that I could not identify. She offered it to Brev, who was standing to my right. Brev stared at it. His neck ridge went through 3 colors, which then, with the deliberate care of a man making a decision he's fully analyzed and accepted the consequences of, he took it. He held it for a moment, which he looked at it. He looked at Vasquez. You consume these, he said, during combat operations. They're small, she said, easy to carry, high sugar for energy, good for focus. She paused. Also, I just like them. Brev turned the clementine over in his hands. He had 4 fingers, which was 1 too many for the gesture to look natural. He turned it over anyway, examining it the way my species examines things when we aren't sure yet whether they're threats or not. He began carefully to peel it. Vasquez watched him with an expression that I'd, after some reflection, categorize as pleased and not wanting to show it fully. I watched them both. The first 6 minutes went exactly as planned, which isn't something I say often. Brenner's unit basically took the level 6 junction, forcing the consortium to pull a security element from level 5 to reinforce. Torres hit level 3 simultaneously, which I didn't fully expect it to work. The consortium's concentration on the critical node meant level 3 was lightly held but not undefended. But Torres apparently shared certain tendencies with Vasquez, because she found the approach they hadn't covered and came through it before they could reorient. Osai, on level 10, did something with the environmental systems that I still don't entirely understand. But the result was that levels 8 and 9 went to partial atmospheric circulation, which created a pressure differential in the level 7 access corridors that would make any movement through them audible from 50 meters. He had apparently pretty much worked out how to do this by reading the station's environmental maintenance logs, which were still accessible through a terminal he'd found on level 10 that the consortium hadn't thought to disable. I asked him about this afterward. He said, "The logs were right there. You can, in my opinion, learn a lot from maintenance logs. These are the humans I was fighting alongside." Timestamp 05-1409. I guess Vasquez and I took level 9 back in 4 minutes. The consortium elements there had already started to fragment, responding to contact on 3 other levels simultaneously, receiving contradictory priority directives, doing what all forces do when the operational picture suddenly doesn't match the plan, hesitating. Hesitation in like an active engagement costs more than almost any other decision. We were at the level 8 access corridor before the hesitation resolved itself. This is where it stopped going as planned. Timestamp 05-2017. The thing it accounted for was the commander. The consortium force on Verath Station had a commanding officer, whose name I later learned was Consortium Subdirector Harith. I'd his profile in my briefing files. Mid-tier command, solid operational record, the kind of officer who had survived his career by being reliably competent rather than brilliantly innovative. The briefing had flagged him as responsive to pressure and tactically adaptable. Tactically adaptable turned out to mean something specific. When the multivector push began hitting his force from 5 directions simultaneously, Harith didn't try to respond to all 5 at once. He identified the sort of real threat levels 5 through 7, the critical node he was holding, and he concentrated everything he had left. He pulled from levels 8, 9, and 10. He let the periphery go, and then he sealed the critical node. 3 blast doors, all of them the heavy reinforced type that the actuator trick would not work on. 3 blast doors and a dedicated security element of at least 30 operators, all funneled into the 3-level corridor stack that contained the docking control systems and the life support coordination hub. He gave us the station. He kept the leverage. My communications with Tors and Brenner and Osai confirmed it in rapid succession. Tors, they've pulled. Plus we I think have level 3, but yeah, they've sealed 5 and 6. Brenner, same on 6. The junction is ours, but the access is closed and I don't have anything that gets through those doors in under an hour. Osai, I've got the environmental data. Subdirector Harith just authorized what I think is a life support management protocol. He can threaten the hub remotely from inside the seal. Vethorin's channel opened before I'd finished reading the reports. Subcommander Vel, his voice was controlled. The consortium commander has effectively reversed our tactical position. We have the station's periphery and he has the leverage point. He is now, in my opinion, in a position to negotiate from strength. Yes, Admiral, what does Specialist Vasquez say? I looked at Vasquez. She was standing in the level 8 corridor looking at her non-regulation scanner. Her expression was the one I'd learned to associate with active problem-solving, not tense, not alarmed, focused in a way that felt different from how my species focuses, like a certain quality of attention that was also somehow a certain quality of stillness. What does he gain? She said. Admiral Harith, he gains leverage for negotiation. He can threaten the life support hub collective forces pull back in exchange for. No, I mean what does Harith gain? She lowered the scanner. He's not the consortium, he's an officer. Officers have careers, plus if he wins this engagement, his career advances. If he loses, it doesn't. She looked at the ceiling at the levels above us conceptually. He's not going to destroy the life support hub. Destroying it kills his negotiating position and also kills several thousand civilian transients on this station, which is a war crime which ends his career in a different way. I relayed this. Vethorin was quiet. She's saying he's bluffing, he said. She's saying the threat has limits. And if she's wrong? I looked at Vasquez. She looked at me. Her expression was unreadable for a moment. Then, I'm not wrong about what he wants. I might, in my opinion, be wrong about what he'll do. She held my gaze. There's a pretty much difference. I reported this precisely. Vethorin was quiet for longer this time, and long enough that I noted the duration, 14 seconds. 14 seconds wasn't a comfortable silence. 14 seconds was an admiral weighing whether to trust a specialist-grade operative's psychological assessment of an opponent over 32 years of standard negotiating doctrine. What does she need? He said. Timestamp 05-2017 and secondary membranes, active, full register and unknown stimulus. Here's the thing, what she needed was a way through the sealed doors. The standard approach, extended breach heavy equipment, 40 to 60 minutes was too slow. Harith would have his negotiating team reach out before we were through, and the negotiation would be conducted in the shadow of his leverage, and the outcome would be at best a consortium partial victory. What she I think needed was something that got through before Harith expected it. There's a service access, Osai said over the channel. Level 5, Sector D near the secondary atmospheric processor. It's in the maintenance logs. The consortium may have found it. They had 11 days, but the logs show it was flagged for deferred repair 18 months ago and the flag is still active. If they found it, they'd have closed it. If they didn't honestly close it, how big? Vasquez asked. 0.9 meters diameter. I'll fit. I can fit, said Brev. I kind of turned to look at him. He was still holding the remainder of the clementine Vasquez had given him. He'd been holding it the entire engagement, I realized. Never ate it, holding it. You don't have to, I began. I know, he said. His neck ridge was the new color again, the one, well, I didn't have a name for. I know I don't have to. Timestamp 05-2441. This is where the timestamps stop. I have reconstructed what follows from external feeds, from unit statements, and from the damage assessments filed afterward. I can tell you the sequence of events with reasonable confidence. I can't tell, I guess, you what was happening in my own log during those 11 minutes and 33 seconds because apparently I stopped logging. What I kind of can tell you is what I was doing. Honestly, I was watching Vasquez. The service access was intact. OSI was right, the consortium hadn't found it, or if they had deprioritized closing it against the more obvious breach vectors. It connected to a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the Level 5 primary containment zone. The primary containment zone was where Harith had his dedicated security element. Vasquez went first and Brev behind her. I followed Brev. The sounds in the service access were the coolant lines, which were running hot because the engagement had pushed several of the station's secondary systems into improved stress operation. The atmospheric processors, which were uneven in a way that suggested OSI's environmental adjustment was still in effect. Vasquez's armor on, the metal. Brev's breathing, which was controlled but not comfortable. No humming this time. We came out of the maintenance corridor into the Level 5 secondary atmospheric zone, a large open space filled with industrial equipment that the kind of consortium hadn't bothered to use as cover because no one was supposed to be in it. The primary containment zone was through a single internal pressure door, which wasn't the heavy reinforced type, which kind of meant the actuator trick worked, which Vasquez did it in 4 seconds this time. The pressure door opened. The primary containment zone was approximately 20 meters by 30, a corridor-adjacent space that had been repurposed into a command position. Harith was there. His security element was there. His communications officer was there with an open channel that had, I assume, been preparing to open formal contact with Vethorin's staff. They hadn't expected to be accessed from inside the containment zone. This is the moment the external feeds show, and I know what the feeds show because I reviewed them 17 times afterward. Vasquez comes through the door first. Revino comes through behind her. I come through third. Harith's security element has a response time of approximately 2 seconds, which under the circumstances is actually quite good. Most of the element shifts to cover the door, the correct response, the trained response, the only reasonable response. Vasquez isn't at the door anymore. She's already moved to the left of the space, to the cover position she apparently identified from a half-second visual scan during entry. She's engaging 2 of the element from a position that forces them to choose between covering her and covering the door. They can't do both. Brev, who I'd like to note had never been in an unplanned breach operation in his career, and whose most recent combat assignment had been station security in a low-threat corridor, Brev goes right. I don't know when he decided this. Don't know if there was a decision. He goes right, and between the 2 of them they've fractured the element's coverage into 3 separate sectors that the element can't simultaneously hold. And I go forward, toward TBH Harith, and not because it was in any plan, not because it was the tactically optimal movement. I have reviewed the external feed and I still can't fully reconstruct the reasoning. I went forward because Harith was the node, and the node needed to be addressed, and Vasquez and Brev were handling the element, and so the forward movement was the available movement. Harith is approximately 1.7 meters tall, which is somewhat shorter than me. He has 4 limbs. He has the specific posture of someone who has been in command long enough to not flinch from threats, which meant he didn't step back when I came through the door, which was probably the correct instinct. He looked at me, his communications officer looked at me, and the open channel looked at nothing, being a piece of equipment. The engagement in the space around us lasted approximately 40 seconds. I know this from the external feed. I didn't experience 40 seconds in any way I could quantify. I said, the service access subdirector, 18 months flagged for deferred repair, plus your team had 11 days. He was quiet. You had everything else, I said. Every other approach vector and the sealed doors were excellent. The security element is well positioned. I glanced at the communications channel. Your negotiating team was ready. He didn't say anything. You missed the service access. He looked past me. I didn't need to look. I could hear that the engagement in the space had resolved. Actually, the element was contained. Brev and Vasquez were somewhere behind me. You know how, he said. It wasn't quite a question. The maintenance logs, I said, and they were accessible from level 10. He closed his eyes, briefly. The kind of brief eye closure that I have come to understand in several species means something in the range of course. The particular exhaustion of hindsight, which I should have checked the maintenance logs, he said. Yes, I guess. He reached forward and closed the open communications channel. The room was quiet, the atmospheric processors ran, the coolant lines hummed. Timestamp 05:37:42. My log resumes here. Gap 11 minutes 33 seconds. Status: Harith in custody, containment zone secured, plus life support hub intact, consortium force on levels 5-7, surrendering. I should tell you what I was doing during those 11 minutes, and I have tried and I can't. I know the mechanical sequence of events. I know what my body did and where my body was. I know actually that I moved through a firefight and a pressure door and a face-to-face conversation with a consortium subdirector, and at some point gave the all-clear signal to Vethorin's staff, and received confirmation that the consortium forces were standing down. But the time stamping, the compulsion, the 40-second interval, the never-once-failed record stopped. I have thought about this a great deal. The closest I have come to an explanation is this: for 11 minutes I wasn't tracking time. I was inside the event, which not observing it, not logging it, not managing it from the necessary professional distance that the timestamps represent, the distance between the thing that's happening and the thing that's being recorded. For 11 minutes there was no distance. Plus, I don't know if that's a failure, I don't know if it's the opposite of a failure. I know that the 11 minutes produced the result. I know that pretty much. The gap in my log is the size and shape of a service access that someone found in an 18-month-old maintenance log and a press door, and a woman who moved through an active threat environment the way she moved through everything without distance, without gap, fully inside the event. I'm still not sure what to call that. Timestamp 053742. Verath Station secured. TBH personal note, first log gap in 11 years. I'm filing it under unknown significance until I have a better category. I suspect I won't find a better category. The debrief took 2 hours and 40 minutes. I have the full log because my timestamping resumed as abruptly as it had stopped and didn't miss a single 40-second interval for the remainder of the operation. Whatever the TBH 11-minute gap was, it was singular, isolated. It hasn't recurred. I think about honestly it often. The debrief covered the standard elements: tactical sequencing, resource expenditure, casualty count, which was, for a contested station operation of this complexity, unexpectedly low on our side, and the decision points that had produced the outcome. Admiral Vethorin ran the debrief personally, which was unusual. He typically delegated to his senior staff. He kept stopping to ask questions about Vasquez. Not challenging questions. The kind of questions you ask when you're trying to construct an accurate model of something you don't fully understand yet. When she identified the actuator housing, how long had she been looking at the door? At what point did she have the Brenner-Torres-Osai plan already developed? The service access. When did she know about the service access? I answered as accurately as I could. The actuator housing, 1 second of observation, and the multivector plan before I'd met her based on conversations she'd had over breakfast. The service access, she hadn't known. Os had found it, but to be fair, she had been the one to ask the right question: what does he need? Not what does he want, that established the time constraint that made the service access relevant. Vethorin was quiet after each answer for slightly longer than seemed comfortable. She seems, he said finally, to be very good at this. I thought about how to respond to that. I thought about the clementines and the notches on the forearm guard and the humming in the maintenance shaft and the way she'd said most things aren't that complicated, with the exact same inflection she might use to describe the weather. She isn't trying to be good at it, I said. She is good at it because she can't be otherwise. Honestly, she notices things, she files them. When they become relevant, they're already there. I paused. I don't think she could turn it off if she wanted to. The notches on the armor, Vethorin said. Yes, Admiral. What are they? I'd asked Vasquez during the post-operation hold. She had looked at the forearm guard for a moment as if she'd forgotten they were there, then said, engagements where something didn't go the way it was supposed to. A pause, where I'd to adapt. Another pause. I count them so I remember that it can always happen, so I don't get comfortable. 23 times the plan broke. 23 times she adapted, and then she cut the notch to remind herself that the 24th time was coming. Vethorin was quiet for a long time after I told him this. Request to keep her unit attached to your division, he said finally. Extended operational actually cycle. I'll pass it on, I said. Timestamp 071402. I found Vasquez in the small alcove the human units had been assigned as temporary quarters. She wasn't doing anything that involved sitting still. She had disassembled both sidearms completely, cleaned every component, and was reassembling them with the focused speed of someone who did this the way I breathed, not thinking about it, just maintaining the ongoing baseline condition of function. Brenner was asleep in the corner. He was sleeping with the absolute thorough commitment of someone who had decided they were done being awake and had carried out that decision immediately. Torres was reading something on a personal device. Osai was doing something to his scanner that might have been maintenance or might have been modification. I chose not to ask. They weren't doing nothing. Every one of them was doing something that maintained some system, some readiness, some future-relevant capacity. I noted this. Admirals requesting an extended attachment, I said to Vasquez. She looked up. And how extended? He didn't specify, likely the next operational cycle. She went back to the reassembly. Okay. You don't have questions about where or what. If it matters, someone will tell me. She fitted a component. Does it matter? I considered this. I suppose not. Then I'll find out when I need to. She glanced up again. You doing okay? The question was unexpected enough that I stood with it for a moment. My species doesn't typically ask this question in a professional context. And I mean a personal context, yes. In a professional context, the assumption is that if something relevant were wrong, you would report it through the appropriate channels. I have a gap in my log, I said. 11 minutes and I mean 33 seconds. She nodded, said nothing, and I have never had a gap before, in 11 years. She finished the reassembly of the second sidearm, held it for a moment, then set it down. Were they important 11 minutes? Yes. Then you weren't missing them, you were in them. She picked up the sidearm again and ran a final check. I stood in the alcove. Tor's device made a small sound. Brenner breathed the total breath of the comprehensively asleep. The station hummed differently now in a post-engagement register, something looser in the mechanical rhythm, the way a structure sounds after it's been under stress and is finding its resting state. I have a word in my language, I said, Velsathari. It means, to be fair, the rearrangement of one's understanding of what is possible. Vasquez looked at me. I use it carefully, I said. I have used it 3 times in my career for events that changed the applicable model of reality. She waited. I'm considering using it now. She was quiet for a moment, then she said simply, for what? I thought about what had changed. I tried to be precise. Not what I'd seen competent tactical operations before, had seen good soldiers make good decisions under pressure, had seen things that were impressive in the specific way that well-executed training is impressive. This wasn't that, and this was the actuator housing. Look, the stress fracture, the 23 notches. The service access that was in the maintenance logs, accessible from a terminal the consortium hadn't thought to disable, because why would they? Because who reads maintenance logs during an active engagement? Like Vasquez reads maintenance logs, not as a strategy, not as a trained behavior, as a reflex, as the same reflex that made her count the pattern of the consortium's movements and store them until they became useful. The same reflex that hummed in maintenance shafts and ate clementines on ammunition crates and told a 32-year admiral that his tactical doctrine was wrong. Not because she'd been told, not because the manual said to, because things have patterns and she couldn't stop noticing them, and so they were always there when she needed them. I'd spent 19 years becoming an expert. She had spent 9 years becoming something I didn't have a word for. For what honestly I understand about preparation, I said finally. I thought I understood preparation, which I timestamp, I document, I log every interval, I know where things stand at every moment. I paused, but I'm always preparing for the expected. I have very good records of the expected. She was listening. You prepare for the unexpected, not by trying to predict it, by making sure you haven't enticed everything all of it all the time so that when the unexpected uses something you've already seen, you recognize it. I looked at the sidearm in her hands, the worn grip, the small for what it's worth, gouge above the trigger housing that had been there before she cleaned it, that would be there after. You read maintenance logs because everything that might matter is potentially in maintenance logs. You count, to be fair, consortium movement patterns because the 4th time might tell you what the first 3 couldn't. You carry fruit because being fed means being functional, and being functional means being available for whatever comes next. Vasquez looked at me for a moment. I just like clementines, she said. Yes, I said, that is also true, both things are true. She almost smiled, which the corner of the expression that would have been a smile. I was getting pretty much better at reading the incomplete versions. Velsathari, she said, trying the word. Her pronunciation was completely wrong and somehow it didn't matter. What does it feel like? I thought about the gap, the 11 minutes, the way my spine's secondary membranes had gone quiet when she'd stood up and pointed at the ceiling in the cargo junction. Like the moment you realize your model was smaller than the thing it was modeling, I said. She considered this for a long moment and yeah, she said, I know that one. The incident report for Verath Station runs to 47 pages. I know because basically I wrote it. I write detailed incident reports. I write them the way I timestamp, compulsively, completely, as a record against the possibility of forgetting. I have, I think, section in the report titled Tactical Innovations that covers the multi-vector engagement, OSI's environmental systems manipulation, the service access approach, and the psychological profiling of Subdirector Harith that established the bluff assessment. This section is 11 pages long. I have actually section titled Personnel Observations that covers Brenner, Tors, OSI Brev, and my own unit. Standard section, 3 pages. I have a section titled Specialist Vasquez, Operational Notes that I added after I'd finished everything else. It isn't standard. It is the "I think" kind of section that senior officers add to reports when they've observed something they can't classify adequately in the standard fields and feel compelled to document it anyway. It is 2 sentences long. Specialist Vasquez proved operational adaptability that doesn't map to any existing category in the collective tactical assessment framework. Recommend development of new framework. I have reviewed those 2 sentences many times. They are accurate, they are also insufficient, but I haven't found better ones and I have been trying. I found her one more time before the division shipped out. She was in the level 9 corridor, the same corridor where I'd first seen her, and she was standing at the wall, not leaning on it, standing in front of it looking at it. Basically at the scorch marks from the initial breach, which were now accompanied by impact marks from the cargo junction engagement. The wall was in aggregate in quite a bit worse condition than it had been 12 hours ago. She was looking at it the way she looked at everything, like it was a maintenance log. Mapping it, I said. I was thinking, she said, about the consortium operator who came through the junction first, the point element. She didn't look away from the wall. He was very fast, best positioned in the whole formation, and he probably would have taken us if the formation had been tighter. A pause. He was good. I stood beside her and looked at the wall. Is that relevant? I asked. I guess no, she said. She stopped, touched the wall lightly with 2 fingers. I guess, want to stop noticing when someone else is good at what they do, even when they're trying to kill me. She took her hand back. I think that's how you stop learning. I looked at the wall. The scorch marks from the initial breach were an older color, partially oxidized. The impact marks from the junction engagement were newer, brighter, with a specific pattern that would tell you, if you knew what to look for, the angle of each discharge, the approximate position of the engagement, the arc of coverage each operator had held. She had looked, at a wall and seen the engagement rerun. Vasquez, I said. Yeah. The 23 notches. She looked at her forearm guard, the groups of 5 and the partial group of 3. After this engagement, I said, will you add one? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet. I need to think about whether something didn't go the way it was supposed to. She ran her thumb along the existing notches. Everything mostly went okay. You went through a service access into a contained security position with 12 collective soldiers and a tactical officer who had never done an unplanned breach operation in his career. Brev was fine. Brev held a clementine for the entire engagement. Something happened to her face that took me a moment to categorize: genuine, unguarded amusement, not the almost smile, the real one. He gave it back to me afterward, she said. Still intact, he just held it the whole time. Yes. That's kind of great. Yes, I said, it is. For what it's worth, she looked back at the wall. The amusement faded into something quieter but not less warm. He can have the rest of the bag if he wants. I've got more. I thought about Brev, about the color his neck ridge had gone when he'd taken the clementine, about the way he'd gone right in the containment zone with no training and no plan, and somehow, without any consultation, the right instinct. I thought about what she'd done to him, not on purpose, not as a strategy, just by being what she was, doing what she did, carrying fruit and noticing things and moving through the world the way she moved. 11 days on, in my opinion, this station, Harith's consortium forces had learned every corridor, sealed every approach, prepared every defense. She'd been here 4 days, she'd talked to people over breakfast. The station was ours. Before we ship out, I said, the incident report, and I have a section, personnel observations, Specialist Vasquez. I wrote 2 sentences. I stopped, restarted, and I want to write what I actually observed. But I, don't have an accurate category. She looked at me. For the preparation, I said, for the way you compile things and notice things, the maintenance logs and the stress fractures and the actuator housing, the 23 notches, the pattern counting. I stopped again. What do you call that? She thought about it, genuinely thought, look, in the way she thought about things, with the whole attention, the kind that didn't perform itself. Paying attention, she said finally. Plus, I stood with this. No, I said, that's what it looks like from the outside, but there must be, in your language, there must be a term for the practice of attending to everything as if it might later be relevant. For operating from a baseline of full environmental awareness, all the time, without deliberate effort. She thought again. I don't think we've a word for it, she said slowly. It's kind of just a way of being. Some people have it more than others. I don't know how to turn it off. A pause. My grandmother used to call it staying awake, like not to sleep, awake to the place you're in, to what's actually there. Staying awake. I stood in level 9 corridor with the scorch marks and the impact marks and the evidence of an engagement that had gone the way it went, because one person had been awake to the maintenance logs and the actuator housing and the stress fractures in the walls of corridors she'd seen once. I thought about Velsathari. I thought about the rearrangement of one's understanding of what is possible. I pretty much thought about 11 minutes and 33 seconds of absent timestamps. In my species language, we've a concept called Threkvar. It means the moment. A word ceases to be the name of a thing and becomes the thing itself. When you stop describing what is and the description becomes what is. I have used this concept in philosophical discussions. I never expected to experience it in a collective issue corridor surrounded by weapons discharge scoring. She said, staying awake, I filed it, not under unknown significance, not under a placeholder category.